City Council Planning Commission meeting. It's 11:05, so darn it, we're already 5 minutes behind, but we're going to get started real quick. Thank you. And we will better make the note. This meeting is being broadcast live on YouTube, Provo City Council, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. Please be aware that microphones in the room pick up noise or paper and other rustling objects. Further, be aware that the microphones can pick up side conversations. Thank you so much for being here. Shannon Ellsworth has agreed to give us an opening prayer. And then we will, well, let's do the roll call first. We'll start with Cliff.
Liz Strachan. Austin Corey.
David Rod. Dave Sewell.
Shannon Ellsworth.
Gary Winterton.
David Harding.
George Stewart.
George Handley.
Deborah Jensen.
Andrew Howard.
Wayne Parker.
Gary McGinn.
Dave Anderson.
Okay, Sharon, thank you.
Our dear kind Father in heaven, we're very grateful for this day and for the rain and snow that we're receiving. And we're grateful for this wonderful city and the opportunity and time and experience that we have to contribute. Thankful for all the people that donate many of their resources to make the city a greater place to live. And Father, we ask you that thou bless us with wisdom, with compassion, with understanding, and with intellect. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Shannon. This is a meeting that Gary and I have talked about a long time. We appreciate you all being here. We need to do this often, and I appreciate the opportunity for you to do this today. We had planned an hour. This is an important thing, and we're going to take just a little bit longer if you're available. If you can't stay, we totally understand, but we thought we'd go about 85 minutes on the complete streets discussion to start with today, and we may need to come back and have some more discussions about this. We're not going to get into the weeds today. We're going to get into just policy discussions and see where we go. Dave Harding wanted to take a minute to start with, and then we'll turn the time over to Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Mancherton. So I'd like to frame the discussion just a little bit. I'm not going to be speaking for or against anything. I'm just framing it. Hopefully, I think we'll all kind of look at this and say, well, yeah, of course, this is how we see it, you know. And I think it would be a good reminder, a good thing just to kind of have out there, make sure we're all on the same page. Now, saying that, if the administration, if any staff, if commissioners, counselors, if anyone sees it differently, then you know, bring it up. But hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. I want to talk high-level kind of policy, but I also like having kind of a concrete example. So a couple of years ago, the council had kind of this program called Walk the Block, where neighborhood chairs could request council members come and walk the neighborhood with them and take a look at some of the challenges they're facing or opportunities that they have. And so council members who wanted to attend, and sometimes staff were invited as well, to walk around and just kind of get to know the neighborhood a little bit. I was able to attend one of those, and the neighborhood chair, we walked around to 4 or 5 different places, talked about a few different things. And one place that she took us was to an intersection, kind of a T intersection, and said, you know, the residents here are really struggling to get across. There's a lot of people that are crossing the street, and cars aren't stopping. We're really struggling here. Knowing this was an item on the agenda, I believe it was a traffic engineer. It's been a couple of years, I kind of forgot, but I believe it was a traffic engineer was with us. And so the neighborhood chair said, you know, look at this place. This seems like we should have a crosswalk here. And so the kind of the question is, you know, are the street facilities adequate and appropriate? Was kind of the question put to us. And we looked at that and kind of common sense, I was like, well, it seems like there should be a crosswalk here. And this one was easy because we were able to answer the question, do they meet city standards. City standards, we could call that city policy, or level of service is something that we've talked about as a council, at least. You know, we talk about parks. We have a level of service for parks, you know, so many acres for so many thousand residents and things like that. So there's just kind of a standard. What is the standard for an intersection like that? And the traffic engineer looked at it and said, ooh, no, for what this intersection is, there should be a crosswalk. 2 weeks later, I saw that as a huge win for the city. That was city government working well. 2 weeks later, we had a crosswalk there. And so this one was easier. Was it adequate? No, because it didn't meet city standards. Let's get it up to city standards. Lines were painted. To me, it was a great success story. Months later, though, the neighborhood chair reached out to me again and said, we are still struggling with this thing. This is still feels very unsafe, and the residents, you know, the cars aren't paying attention, and it was a struggle. That one was a lot harder. Asking the same question: Is this painted crosswalk sufficient for this intersection? Well, we said, does it meet city standards? And the answer was, the decision was, yeah, this is what our city standards call for, whether that's policy or level of service, however we want to frame that. That's what the city standards called for. And so then it was like this question, well, the residents really want this, and well, yeah, but people also want to drive, you know, and not have congestion, and also, you know, we like our taxes low and all of that. And so that it was a lot harder. It was not like a 2 week, hey, let's get this thing fixed. But there's kind of another question to answer when asking, are the street facilities adequate and appropriate? And that's, you know, and if it meets the standards, then the question is, are our policies sufficient? And that is a much harder question. If you say, well, this meets the standards, but it still isn't enough, now we kind of have to look at, well, let's take a look at our policies. Policies, that's where we balance different competing interests. That's where we went through this with the West Side Development Planning Committee. I got that name right. You know, we want a lot of stuff, but we don't necessarily always want to pay for it, or we don't necessarily want all the things that go along with it. Parking example, in general, we all want to be able to park out in front of our house. Now, we don't want to pay for that. You know, that's not part of what we're assessed when we buy the house. It's public property, but we want to park there. We don't want anyone else to park there. We want Provo City to enforce that no one else parks there, and then we get to have that free space in front of ours. And we don't want to pay high taxes to actually do all that. So sometimes the public wants a whole lot of things, and they're not mutually exclusive. Are our policies sufficient? To me, that's why we're kind of here looking at complete street policies. To me, what we're doing is we're looking at what is our policies for street facilities. Do we need to update them? Does the community want something different than we have going now? So that's just how I wanted to frame this. Frame this thing. To me, we are looking at what are the city policies, and that affects how much it costs, and what are we committed to, and these policies need to be uniformly applied across the city. Now, they'll vary depending on what the situations are for the intersections, but we need to have uniform policies that are applied across the city. And let's make sure, you know, as these bodies, let's look at what the community wants and move forward wisely with that. So, thank you.
Hey, Gary, you're up.
Okay, well, thank you for this meeting. And as many of you know, I'm the Director of Community Development. But what a lot of people don't realize, by being the Director of Community Development, I'm also the Executive Director of the Planning Commission. That's one of my roles, is being the Executive Director and helping them through their process. So a while back, the city's Transportation Mobility Advisory Committee, and this has been quite a while back, started talking about some things dealing with transportation and mobility and start talking about complete streets. And so for a while, worked on a draft complete street policy that they would then would go on to Planning Commission. Planning Commission would ultimately look at it, have some hearings, do due diligence on it, then pass on a recommendation to the council of whether a complete street policy makes sense to the city and what it should say and what it should do. So TMAC, after about a year's worth of work, had done this, and they had a draft that went to Planning Commission. Planning Commission has been introduced to it. They've been thinking about it a little bit. And as things come up, I started hearing all these things about complete streets. And I think the Planning Commission has heard. I've heard from complete streets if we have a complete street policy, there will never be another accident in Provo City again. And that's probably not true. If we have a complete street policy, it will put the city into bankruptcy. And that's probably not true. And so as the Planning Commission has heard a lot about this, has been talking about complete streets, and has held a couple of preliminary hearings and a study meeting to gather some information. In our last study meeting, whenever that was, I can't remember, they all run together. As Planning Commission was talking about it, one of the things that was occurring is somebody would come up and say, I want you to know I support the complete street policy. And they would go, well, we don't even have one yet. You know, we have a draft and some ideas, but there's not yet a complete street policy. And there's a lot of good people out there on all sides of this issue that have concerns and issues that they would like raised on it. And I let the Planning Commission know that I had heard back from council members who had concerns about this, that you know, a complete street policy would be very concerning to everybody if it attempts to force the city to spend money it doesn't have, or somehow force us to raise taxes. And that's a concern of mine. I think that's a concern of Planning Commission members. And so in our discussion, the Planning Commission decided, you know, why don't we have a meeting with a couple of groups? How about let's sit down and see if we can get a joint meeting, a joint Planning Commission meeting with the municipal council, and talk, not dive down into the details about individual words or anything like that, but just stay on a very high 60,000 foot level about what is a complete street policy. Do we want one? What would it look like? What are things that we ought to be concerned about if we have one? And what's the intent of a complete street policy, and what would it be trying to do? Planning Commission also has requested that they have a joint meeting with TMAC to talk with TMAC, who, and understanding that they've spent a lot of time on this, want to make sure they understand their intent. And again, not to dive down at this point into individual words, but to stay on a high level of what's the intent of this? Well, you know, what are we trying to accomplish? You know, what are some of the dangers, and keep that at a very high level. And then Planning Commission from there would come back and deal with a complete street policy, and at some point make a specific proposal and recommendation that would go to the municipal council. And so this is the first of those two meetings, and they asked to do that. And so we got with council staff, and so that's kind of in a nutshell why we're here. So at this point, if I can introduce Deborah, she's the chair of our Planning Commission, and kind of punt over to the Planning Commission.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for inviting us to participate in this discussion. It's something we've been talking about doing since the first of the year, actually, so we're pleased to be able to sit down with you today and begin having this discussion, and hopefully other discussions on other topics during the year. One of the things during our initial discussion within the Planning Commission about complete streets as a policy, not necessarily what TMAC has written or anything else, but just conceptually as a policy for a community. One of the things that started coming up was that many people wanted to jump into the details of how does this work? How is it adopted? How do we write the ordinances? And really at this point, that is so premature because we really need to figure out, from my perspective, where our common ground is. What are the things that we all want to see happen for Provo? What are the kinds of improvements we'd like to see moving forward in time with our public realm, which is our street network, including sidewalks, bike trails, the actual streets that move vehicles, and understanding that getting that right not only improves the livability for everyone of all ages and abilities, but it also fosters an improvement in economic development. If you create an attractive place that people really want to be in, then that's going to show itself in your bottom line as well. So coming out of our discussions just within the Planning Commission, I think most commissioners at this point conceptually support the idea of readdressing how we regulate or how we design our streets so that it's more inclusive for all modes of pedestrians, bikes, all ages, and particularly with the recent investment and ongoing investment in public transportation. Those kinds of investments in the public realm will help to support public transportation investments over time. And that's been proven across many cities who have undertaken policies such as this. The other thing I think that I'd like to mention is that complete streets is not a new concept. It was adopted in 2004 by the National Transportation Board, I believe that's who, NTSB, and supported by ITE. They actually helped collaborate and write the original guidelines for that. It's now been adopted by the state of California as a whole, the state of Florida as a whole, and part of their thinking in adopting it statewide was to help improve public safety because they were seeing so many pedestrians killed, especially Florida. I don't know how many of you have been in Florida recently, but it is not pedestrian friendly, very wide streets, high volumes of traffic, and yet we have major tourist attractions such as convention centers and entertainment venues. So there are lots of good examples out there about how to write these policies, how to implement them, lots of good lessons learned, and I think over time, if we delve into this, we can really learn some lessons and maybe avoid some of the potential pitfalls that other communities have faced. Any other commissioners want to contribute to that?
And I really appreciate that, and I appreciated David's presentation at the beginning. I would just add a couple of questions that I think summarize what our conversations have been like in the Planning Commission, and that is, what are our streets for? Beyond just what are the policies and are they safe, but like what are our streets for? Who are they for? And who, in a sense, who gets to make decisions about how we use our streets? And I think that there's been, in some ways, I think that's an important discussion to have. Is what are streets for, and how do we make decisions about them? Who gets to make decisions about them?
One thing that, as you talked about, what is a street for? I think it's like children. Each street is different. And I can say each street has to have everything on it. And I've talked with Gary. We look at what the street is for. And I appreciate, what is this street for? Sometimes it's to move traffic. Sometimes it's to have pedestrians be walking. Sometimes it's for bikes. Every street is not appropriate for a bike. Every street is not appropriate for cars all the time, to have cars going at 40 miles an hour. Each street is different, and I think that that's something that we can involve all of the groups in determining what each street should be doing, because they're not all the same, in my mind.
Can I ask a question? In your discussions, how much did the need or a desire for more walkability, more bikeability in the city factor into the feeling that this kind of rethinking of how we design streets? So I'm thinking beyond just safety issues. I'm thinking in terms of, is there an ambition on the part of the Planning Commission and TMAC to see Provo 20 years from now being, where more people are biking than currently, or more people are walking than currently, more people are using mass transit than currently?
I think that certainly weighed into our discussion. I don't like to cast stones, but if you look at Orange City, which doesn't have really a city center, they're trying to fix that now, and is not walkable, and yet has great economic engines in terms of retail and other uses. Provo is miles ahead of Orange City. We have, fortunately, a good network of streets, sidewalks. We have streets that are too wide in many cases, and that's why you have speeding problems, for example, in neighborhoods. But I think all of us on the Planning Commission, and correct me if I'm wrong, would like to see Provo be more of a walkable, bikeable, as well as, using your car, of course, and we know we have freight to deal with as well, coming through on the state highway. But the overall intent is, as you were saying, not to make every street conform to a certain standard, but really look at the relationship between its context and its purpose. So specifically land uses. So if you have a residential land use, low density, you certainly don't expect all of those streets to have bike lanes. Some of them may, if they're more of a connector to other destinations, to public park or school or something like that. But certainly you would expect a street like University Avenue that's going to have transit running down it, has retail and commercial and residential uses, connecting University to major transit areas. You expect that to be more of a complete streets kind of scenario where you have easy access for all modes. It's very safe to walk on, safe to cross the street. And some of those things, I like the example that you gave, David, about just putting a crosswalk in to an existing condition, because you can put a crosswalk in, but if the street is too wide, people are encouraged to speed. If the curve, the turn radius, the radius of the actual turn is too big, then cars just speed right around it. So there's so many little details in the design, and I think those are the kinds of things we start to look at in more detail once we get into development of the Complete Streets program.
On line 23 of the policy draft, it says multimodal transportation network that provides mobility and access as an alternative to the automotive-oriented network. The problem in Provo is that we are an automotive-oriented population because we have no public transportation coming into the neighborhoods. So there's no way to get from my neighborhood to Sam's Club or to the mall. I have to drive a car. So an alternative to me is an alternative to a small portion of the population, not the vast majority of the population. In fact, this is the in the draft from also our Public Works Department. I also believe that to adopt a policy which forces the city to focus on these two modes of transportation will significantly harm advances which have been made in other modes of transportation, which largely have come from additional funding sources. So the City Council and the City Administration for years has tried to balance the need for walkability and bikeability with automotive travel. I think they've done a good job, and for any other group to think they know better than our transportation department, our public works department, is really a problem. Because they deal with this every day, they deal with maintenance, they deal with the amount of traffic traveling on every highway, every road, every street. And so I really think we have to look for public works department and the roads department to decide what we're gonna do. It's nice to have some high level stuff is nice, but the actual day-to-day transportation needs of our citizens are what's paramount to George Stewart. This high level, and this is a very high level, again, taking away if you really work, Gary said don't worry about the words. I worry about words. Words in a policy are very important. And I agree with the assessment that this will take away from the city council and administration much of the decision-making on what our streets look like and how they're run and maintained.
And I understand that, George, the way it is right now. I think that we can, I think that we need to step back and look at those things so that we don't, as a community, get ourselves where we are committed on every street in every area. I think that we need to look at the picture, just look at it as a big picture though, and see where we're at. What do we hope for?
George, and no, words are important. And that's not what I'm saying is ignore the words. Words are very important. But we're just hearing so much about that this policy will do this or that let's have a high level meeting of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Then if there's a meeting of the mind of that, then let's make sure the words articulate that and reflect that. And, you know, you brought up some things that, for instance, that a complete street policy shouldn't take away the ability of the municipal council to exercise its authority. And I think I would agree completely with that. And that if words don't accurately reflect that, then those do need to be redrafted.
Right.
Dave?
So we have the general plan, we have lots of plans for transportation, business, you name it. And the general plan, and I believe the other plans that are associated with the general plan, are recommending documents. And as that, they are guidelines for future decisions and where we want to be and what we want to become. So I'm just concerned at what level, because you're talking, you know, high level, where do we want this to fit into the picture? Do we want this to also be kind of a part of the general plan, a recommending document, a vision, or do we want it to be something that is more strict that says it's a mandate and that you have to do certain things? And I would go with that would be equal to the general plan, a part of the general plan, and a recommending document, a guideline.
I just maybe go back to Mr. Stewart's comment for a moment. I think the assumption that the status quo is acceptable to us is one that I don't agree with. I mean, in terms of not only the safety issues that I think have been really palpably made evident to us just in recent weeks, but also sort of what the future of Provo looks like, what we want it to look like. I mean, that's sort of what I'm hearing this conversation is about. And I think I do think we're better than Orem. Of course we are. But Orem has many virtues, and some of my closest friends live in Orem. Let's just get all that out there. But I would say I think we have a lot of room to improve, and I think the fact that we're going to grow in this valley, whether or not the rate of growth happens in the city is equal to where it happens elsewhere in the valley, the growth in the valley is going to impact the central hub city of the valley, which is Provo, in some very significant ways. And if we can't make our city much more aggressively bikeable and walkable than the status quo, I think we're in big, big trouble. So that was why I was asking that question. I mean, I think it's important, at least for me, to make sure that when we have this discussion, we get enough out of the weeds to be able to say, well, where are we headed in a decade, in 2 decades, and 3 decades? And are recommending policies in the general plan sufficient to make a transition that we need to make? And I would argue that they're not. I think this is something with a little more teeth, with enough flexibility so that it doesn't bind us on any particular street in a way that ends up designing something that we don't need in the city. I think that's, I see that language in here, and I think the more we keep working through that to make sure it's maximally flexible and also affordable, I think are all very important considerations. But I think the idea that we're already sufficiently balancing biking and walking with automobiles, I completely disagree.
Church.
I don't think the city council, the city administration, or the public works department has ever been satisfied with the status quo. We're always looking to improve. It just depends on what you think is improvement, what you think is important, and certainly that's worth a discussion. But I don't think, I've never been satisfied with the status quo in my years in city service. I know our public works department is always looking to improve safety and improve walkability and improve bikeability. But again, it just depends how far you go, and does it really satisfy the needs of the general community, not just a particular segment of the community that has some particular goals.
Just to reinforce what I hear George saying is that part of what we need to consider, though, is also the future community that's not here yet, right? So they deserve consideration as well. And I think that one of the questions that I was asking at the beginning, Mr. Stewart, gets to something that you raised, which is, who are our streets for? Or what are streets for, and who are they for? And that question is closely related to then who gets to make decisions, and or maybe it's not so much even about who gets to make decisions, but who has the right to have input and a say. And it seems to me that what we were hearing in our planning commission hearings, not just from commissioners, but from the public, many of whom are here today, is that we feel like there should be more people. Certainly Public Works has expertise and training, but to simply abdicate all responsibility or all input just to that one body seems to me like it's shortchanging the community. And in my mind, to answer that question, who are streets for, is it's for everybody. They're our city's most valuable public spaces. They're not just for cars to get around in. Therefore, it seems to me that it's worth thinking about the process that we go through in making decisions about our streets, how they get designed, who they're for, what. And again, I don't know what the process is in place right now, but to just say, well, we're gonna let Public Works make all the decisions and have no kind of hearing or no opportunity for the public to weigh in, feels to me like that's not the best way to go.
I didn't think I said that. Is that what you heard me say?
I heard you say, I feel like we need to leave the decisions about streets to Public Works, who are seeing things every day and dealing with this. And again, I'm not saying that we should cut them out. And I feel like there's been some concern about wanting to cut out Public Works entirely. And I don't think that's at all what we've been hearing or talking about as a planning commission. I just think we're saying, let's think about who gets to make the decisions and what the process is for designing streets. And let's open it up. And since the streets are for everybody, and let's allow people to weigh in. Let's make sure that the processes are in place.
I don't think I would ever be in favor of not having the public input. That's why I've been on city council for 2 terms and then mayor. We looked at city input. But again, we also have to take input from our public works department.
Sure. And I don't think, again, my reading of the complete streets policy in no way suggests that we're trying to cut out Public Works entirely. I just think we're saying let's talk about the process through which we make decisions about our streets.
Certainly diminish the role of Public Works, diminish the role of the council, and diminish the role of the administration, this policy, the way it was written.
I disagree about that, but
well, the words say that.
I don't think they do, sir.
When they read it.
I don't think they do in my reading of it.
Great discussion. I love it. I hope I can remember everything. I'll try to move through quickly. Just a quick thought. When we say streets, if we can all kind of agree, when we talk about streets, we're talking about the street system. We're not talking about individual streets. Obviously, the street system is made up of individual streets. But when I hear what are streets for, it's not necessarily saying what's in every individual street for. It's what is the street system for. And so when we talk about complete streets, I think it's degree that we're talking about the system, the transportation system as a whole. I appreciate what I heard Mr. McGinn talk about is we want to talk about this at a high level, policy level, not get into the words, because we can, if we can agree on kind of the vision and the overall goals and that, then we can work out the words. But if we don't have this agreed upon, then we're not going to be able to move forward very easily. As far as how it's implemented, I think that's kind of a half step down, and maybe that's worth talking about a little bit. My take on it, whether it's, I think we need to have the vision in place, and I actually think we mostly do. Between Vision 2030 and our general plan already talks about complete streets and things, and so I think we've kind of got the vision kind of in place. Maybe it needs to be solidified here or there, tweaked here or there. Does it need to be a policy? I'm open to hear from the Planning Commission, from TMAC, from Public Works, from Community Development, what their suggestions on how to implement that. I personally, I think I'd be just as fine. I haven't worked all the way through it. I haven't looked at it nearly as much as other people, but I think I'd be just as fine having complete street principles interwoven into all of our public transportation guidelines and principles and policies, all of that. But if we have that integrated in, do we need to have a standalone document? Or maybe we do. Maybe it's good to have one place that really kind of defines it, or maybe we don't. Maybe having it integrated into everything is fine. Or maybe the complete streets policy is needed for a time while we redo the transportation master plan and help guide the redo of the transportation master plan. And maybe once that's done, maybe the complete streets policy is no longer needed because it's already integrated. So I think all of those are good questions, all of the good discussion, and it has been a little heated and different things, but so far I think the process is working. We have a proposal, we have different people weighing in on it, it's going to get revised, and I mean, hopefully everyone's been excited about this, and hopefully we can keep working civilly and respectfully, and it's good to hear different points of view.
Shannon, I think, was next.
Yeah, I just want to bring it back to kind of this values level. I think we all value safety, right? And I think that's why we had so many people at our planning commission meetings who were speaking about it, is because they value safety and we value safety, and Public Works values safety. And I think our friends and neighbors and the citizens are just, they're demanding safety today, but then we also want to look at the walkability and bikeability of tomorrow, right? Because these are decisions that will affect the city long after each one of us is gone. And I would just add to what Deborah said earlier, that it's really not a trendy policy. It's a very stable, very organized, very implementable, very practical solution for safety, and as well as other elements that we'd like to improve in our community, like health, right? Community health. It's also a solution for air quality in some ways. And so I would just say those two things. I think that it's important that we understand the value of safety, and that this is really a long-term solution, not for everything, but it's an important long-term solution.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of people are worried about how this is applied. I think there is truth that the vision is probably there, and I personally see it as a visionary document as it is now. But people are concerned about the costs and who bears those costs and how much and who gets to make those decisions. I'll also say, though, that like many of the people have said, that this is not a new thing to other cities. And if you've traveled around to major cities elsewhere, if it's applied correctly, it can be a real boom for the local economy. If it's not, it'll be a detriment. And I think that that's a pinch point that needs to be considered in this deliberation. And but I do think if some of these things are reviewed as they've been applied elsewhere, I think we can glean some insight as to the benefits that it can offer. Because I do think, like downtown, there needs to be more avenues, more pedestrian friendly and biking, but it has to be well thought out. And certainly something like that would not apply in other parts of the city.
Yeah, maybe just to speak, just from my perspective, to the merit of the idea of a complete streets approach, which can mean different things to a lot of different people. I understand that certainly, but you know, one view that I have is that I think probably the streets that Provo City owns and cares for are among our biggest asset as residents of the community. There's a lot of value there. We invest heavily in those as an asset. And yeah, from one perspective, having a complete streets program as a way to evaluate different needs in different situations, I think context matters tremendously relative to how we maximize the value of that investment, whether it's to provide access to single-family detached homes on quarter-acre lots and to make sure the kids can get to and from elementary schools comfortably and to where their parents feel like that's safe, or moving cars down University Avenue where we all have to get to and from work and do different things like that, and they're very different needs. And honestly, I think that without having some kind of perspective where we're trying to evaluate the individual needs of those different facilities, again, in some type of particular context, we're not going to realize really the potential that investment could have for the community. And that's a big part of the reason why I think just a different perspective relative to how we look at streets, who they serve, needs, and things like that can be a benefit for the city.
So this is a national policy guideline, and I went online trying to find a document, a national document. I couldn't actually find it.
There's 10.
There's 10?
There's many. That's the problem.
Challenge.
That's the hard part.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, kind of like, what was the genesis of our current proposal? Did we just make it up as we go? Did they find one of the 10 that they liked? So are we, how similar are we to what's happening in the rest of the country, and how different are we? Are we customizing the model for Provo and its unique circumstances?
Gary? And that's a good question. It started with TMAC, and Markham, who's on our TMAC, is here, and he could talk to that. Austin, who's been the primary staff member from community development, helping on through the process. If you want, they could, either one of them could probably address that. Planning Commission is going to meet later with TMAC.
Ben, do you want to say something?
I would, okay.
Go ahead and take it.
Okay, let me just say that in our last meeting, TMAC, we felt badly that our intent seems to have been misinterpreted with this. We didn't see this as a rigid policy. We saw it as a flexible framework that would help us and guide us as we do transportation related projects. Most of those projects have a 30 to 50 year life. And so you have to think about who will be using them next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. The intent was to try to make this balanced. Automobile transportation will still be a major mode, no question. We hope there'll be more mass transit. And we want people to be able to get to school, to church, to restaurants, to parks on bicycles or walking. There's a lot of reasons for that. But so TMAC would welcome more interaction with the planning commission and or the council to talk about our intent. We're not trying to take over any administrative role here. We're trying to simply consolidate ideas that we looked at in other cities that had some characteristics like Provo, and I've never found one just like Provo. But there have been an awful lot of cities working on a complete street approach to their transportation planning, and therefore testing against the projects that they come along. So again, TMAC's very open to have more input. We had, Dave Harding was a member of TMAC when this first started. John Turley, who was a member of the Planning Commission, was on TMAC. Kim Santiago was the advisor to TMAC from the council, and she attended almost every meeting. And just remember, TMAC meets for an hour and a half once a month. So we say we've been working on something for a year, we're all the way up to about 15, 16 hours on it, which is not a lot.
Okay, well, that
helps. So let's keep it in perspective. We're not trying to take over or even expand our responsibility. We're trying to make some suggestions to the decision makers that we see in the Planning Commission and Council about what might make sense for us to test against as we go forward in helping keep Provo on top in so many things. Any questions about where TMAC came from? Thank you.
George.
I think one concern is some of the wording, when we talk about urban design, we're not truly an urban community yet. Compared to New York or Los Angeles, we're basically pretty suburban still. I live in a suburban area. I don't consider where I live urban. There are parts of Provo that are very much more urban.
And that's why I think we're all so different. Each street is so different in my
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But the policy seemed to treat the city as an urban facility, an urban place, but we're not considered, in my mind, at least where I live, I don't consider I'm the same as I live downtown. I would have different standards for downtown than I would for where I live without questions.
And I think that's what this, hopefully this policy will ultimately recognize.
Right.
The needs and what we hope to accomplish. Everybody just jump in. I don't want to be pointing at people. This is a conversation.
Traffic direct.
I'll just comment on that. Urban design is really, you're misconstruing what it means. Urban design is concerned with the design, the physical design of the public realm, which is everything except private property and buildings that sit on them. So it's the container that includes the sidewalk, the setbacks, the parking spaces, the streets themselves. So urban design concerns itself to how those things are actually physically arranged in space, whether they're in a small suburban context or if they're in a downtown. So it's not necessarily an urban application. And I'm an urban planner and an urban designer, so I've worked in all sizes of communities on everything from small residential streets to intensely used downtown cores. And it's just as important in a residential area that we get it right as it is in the downtown core. My other comment that I'm hearing from around the table today is that collaboration going through this process is going to be incredibly important because we have a huge array of talent sitting here. Everything from economic development specialists to planners to people that have done the heavy lifting by volunteering to serve on TMAC and doing the research and writing preliminary reports for us all to even have this dialogue about. So I think there's a lot of strength in continuing this dialogue and really trying to focus on the issues, our goals and intent, and not to get into the wordsmithing and the details about who's going to do what when. But I'm hopeful that the collaboration with all of these people in the room continues and that we do have a good dialogue about all the sticking points so we can all come to some sort of consensus about what direction to go in.
Go ahead, Dave.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate the work that's gone into this, especially realizing it's only 15 or so hours of work. This amazing document. I strongly support the vision. And
I gotta correct one thing. Austin's probably spent 60 hours. And he's guided us in our 15 hours.
Very good. So that part of it, I think, is wonderful. My questions are more, as has been discussed on the administrative side, sort of how administrative powers are wielded, who approves what, and some of the implementation details. Some of that in here seems to go beyond what we normally approve as policy on the legislative side. It seems to me that we'd almost have to have the mayor approve this jointly because of sort of the administrative process detail that's in here. Or maybe some of that is separated out into a document that the administration approves and we concentrate more on the policy details in this. I don't know. But I think that's where the main sticking point is just how those, I want to make sure the administration is comfortable with the implementation details and the approval details and the process details.
Have class, I'm excuse myself.
Thank you for coming.
Apologize as well.
Okay, and before you leave, we're probably gonna need, we want to hear the administration, and I appreciate they bringing that up at this point. And there are concerns. Everybody's gonna have concerns on how this would roll out and how it would be implemented. Dave, you want to take a few minutes now and take?
How much time do you want me to spend?
Oh, give us the 20-minute version here, and let's see where we go.
We'll see if we can, if Jimmy and Elizabeth maybe can bring up a presentation that I put together and why they're doing it as I work to go through this. Let me just give you a little bit of an introduction here. And I think most of you have received a memo that I drafted, and I think there's two paragraphs that I really want to emphasize in the memo. The first one, and I'll just read the memo if you haven't, and it says, "My objective and intent in writing this memo is not to critique the goals intended in the proposed policy, although some of the elements of the policy need to be reviewed and modified, nor is my intent to critique the members of the or potential actions of the Planning Commission or TMAC." So let me just make a couple of comments there. And I want to emphasize this, and it's my intent, and I'm doing this purposely so that you understand. The memo is not drafted to be a negative to either the Planning Commission or TMAC. My interactions with both of those bodies, although they have been somewhat limited, both groups have been very gracious, very good to work with. I've come to Planning Commission a couple of times on water or wastewater issues, really have very little interaction with Planning Commission, but in every single instance, they have been very good, very receptive, very open, very engaging in the concerns from Public Works. And I think partly the way TMAC, the way this memo and the Complete Streets policy was rolled out, I think it has shined a light in Public Works inappropriately. The memo was not intended to go to Planning Commission or TMAC. It was an internal memo. It was inappropriately given to both of those groups without an adequate explanation. I've also had meetings where I've been told that there are groups, transportation groups within the city that are calling for dismissal of everybody in engineering. They're calling them obstructionists. And you can bet your bottom dollar that I'm going to take offense to that. I'm not okay with that kind of an attitude. And when we talk about being civil and having
an appropriate dialogue, I think it's important to get the whole story. And frankly, I don't think the whole story on this has been illustrated. And I appreciate the opportunity to have just a little bit of time and talk about, a lot of it is implementation. A lot of my concerns are implementation. And I have to tell you, Public Works is going to implement a lot of this. We're going to be responsible for it. So I should rightly be concerned about the implementation. It's okay to have a lofty goal. And I think, again, if you read the memo carefully, I'm not critiquing a lot of the goals in the policy. There's a lot of good things. And I think Public Works would be one of the first departments that would stand in line and say, could we do more in doing streets and safety issues? We definitely would be. In fact, this presentation will illustrate just exactly how far behind we are in many cases. But it's mostly financial. My concern is mostly, can we afford this policy? It's okay to have this high-level policy, but if we can't achieve it, or if we're diverting funds from where we're at, we're going to go backwards in some areas. So I think the first thing that I want to show in this presentation is exactly where funding is coming from streets. So the first three columns, BNC, UTF, and BNC, I call it general fund, those are fairly consistent funding sources that the city has from year to year. The other two columns are inconsistent. They come from MAG, UDOT, CDBG funds, things that are not consistent funding sources. And we're going to concentrate for quite a bit of time on where the funding comes from on the consistent level citywide. So this is an illustration of just citywide funding. And the first line talks about the revenue that we get in BNC road funds. We get about $3 million. It's a little bit more now, but over the past 5 years, we've averaged about $3 million in BNC road funding. It comes from gas tax. I think most people know what BNC funding is. But we also get from the utilities, we get a 1% transfer. And that funding's illustrated in the second row down. So we totaled those up, and then we took out the street expenses. So this is operations and maintenance for a street section in Public Works. So the variance is the difference between the total revenue that we get in and the expenses that we just illustrated. So the line where it says variance, that says that's how much consistently the city has. Now, that doesn't count MAG, UDOT, other projects that come and go from year to year, but we consistently get about that revenue that you can see right there. Now, that looks like a fairly high amount of revenue, but when you look at street maintenance and the conversation, we'll talk about UTF here in just a second. When you understand the UTF and the need for street maintenance, we had a study done in the city that said, we are falling behind. This was about 5 years ago. We were falling behind in street maintenance. And you got to realize street maintenance covers multi-modes of transportation. That's not just motor vehicles. But they came back and said, you need to spend about $4 million a year just to keep up with street maintenance. And Mayor Curtis at the time was here, and he said, do you think we can do it for less than $4 million? And we said, yeah, we think we probably can do it for about $3 or $3.3 million. Dave Gray spent quite a bit of time coming up with that number, but we agreed at the time prior to the UTF implementation of UTF that we felt like about $3.3 million could get us by on street maintenance. So when you consider the UTF now brings in about 2.3 out of the variance right there, that blue line at the bottom that's left over, we have to take $1 million for street maintenance out of that, out of every single one of those lines. We also, in the implementation of UTF, we agreed with Mayor Curtis to fund better improvements for sidewalk replacement. In the last 2 or 3 fiscal years, we have dedicated $500,000 for sidewalk improvements. And so if you take $1.5 million out of the bottom line right there, how much is left for projects? It's not very much money. Go ahead, please.
Just so understanding, so are street expenses not maintenance? And if not, what are in street expenses?
So street expenses is our street section operation, personnel, and materials. So this is
This is our public works section in streets. We have about 20 full-time employees. That's their staff time, that's their operations, that's all expenses. That's snow plowing, everything.
Okay, but not street maintenance. Okay.
Well, other than material. So if they're using asphalt or crack seal, something like that,
Okay.
that's included in that. But if it's a project, so when I talk about a project, that's something that we bid out. We're giving out to another contractor that's outside the city to do. So again, you can look. We have in some years less than $1 million. A few years we have a little over $1 million for projects. Okay. This is also an important point financially to understand for the city. So this is a list of projects going back to about 2012, 2013 fiscal year. These are total projects that we've done, all sources of funding, city and outside sources, UDOT, MAG, everything that's coming in. And you can see what I asked engineering to do is to go in and categorize all the projects into motorized and non-motorized projects, just to come up with a comparison of how much money we're spending total for non-motorized projects. It's about 21% is what we're spending right now on all revenue sources. It's important to understand that the overlay project, I don't know if this has got a pointer on it or not, right there, that overlay project is not, in my mind, a true CIP project. That's just street maintenance. If you take that project out of the calculations, it goes nearly to 24% being spent on non-motorized projects. So bike, pedestrians, mass transit, and by the way, BRT is not included in these calculations right there. The city's portion, the match, is not included. So we have not tried to distort the numbers using BRT to try to, to again, paint some odd picture for the council. That's about what we're spending in transportation for non-motorized vehicles. So as far as pedestrians, again, $500,000 in sidewalk, it sounds like that's a significant amount of money. But when you realize that right now, in order to keep up, we need about $4 million just to replace sidewalk. That's just to keep up with sidewalk improvements in the city. As far as complaints that we get in sidewalk, we keep a database in engineering, and this is not missing sidewalk. This is just sidewalk that is in need of repair. You can see how many requests we got each of those years. How many requests have not been completed yet are in the next column over, and the cost to complete those. $500,000 a year doesn't go very far very quickly, and especially when you start to throw in this, where we've estimated the total number of missing sidewalk in the city, about $23 million, and that's for concrete only. And that assumes, you got to realize that assumes, that dollar amount assumes that we have the right of way, we have no utilities to move, we have no other improvements in the area that have to be done. So if we have to go and buy right of way, that cost all goes up. So again, look at how many years at $500,000, even if we dedicated the $500,000 a year to replace sidewalks that are missing in the city, how many years does it take just to complete that portion of it? So this was one, and I picked this. George Hanley actually sent me a complaint from a citizen on a sidewalk, and I picked it just because it was recent. We're going to be able to remember it. It's in the Tree Streets. Do you think this sidewalk's going to get replaced this year? It needs it. I guarantee it. It needs it. But we don't have the funding. This is actually rated a number 2. So we have ratings 1 through 3 as far as sidewalk complaints. This is a number 2, and we are not even through the number 1s yet in the city. So that tells you how far behind we are as far as sidewalks. So this one is not going to be replaced. I think it's important to realize just how bad, and I think you're kind of getting the picture of why I'm concerned about this. We're going to skip this one right here. This is a graph that talked about the UTF, and it's important to understand UTF was mostly aimed at street maintenance. And we tried to illustrate to the council that work that's done in the early years of the life of a road will save significant dollars later on. If you let your roads go south and they're 7, 10, 12 years old, it's going to cost the city significant amounts of money. When I hear comments made about the streets policy, the streets policy, there was a comment made last week about, well, it's not going to cost more money. We can take our streets crews and we can go and do projects that are part of the complete streets policy. The underlying assumption in that kind of a statement is the current work that our street section has no value. There's nothing important that they're doing. Because if you thought otherwise, you'd realize that they are doing important stuff that keeps our streets in the condition on the top. And if we take those street crews out and they're not doing the basic maintenance on streets, our streets are going to fall off that curve, and it's going to cost us more money in the long run. Yes, if you only budget and you only look at the bottom line on the budget for streets and you go, well, Richard Snyder's crews still are, we're only spending $2 million a year on Richard Snyder's crews. That's right. But eventually you're going to pay the piper on street maintenance. It will catch up to you and it will cost the city more money. And that's one of the main points that I think it's important that I try to emphasize in the memo. If we shift funding, if we change funding from street maintenance, we will eventually fall behind this curve and it will eventually catch up to us. So it's important to understand where we're at, what the purpose of the UTF, what the purpose of BNC road funds are, and if we're going to pay for more things, where's the money going to come from? And it's a key piece of the information.
Dave, I'm going to ask you to wrap up in 10 minutes here.
That's fine. I should easily be done. So Stadium Avenue has been talked about a couple of times, and Stadium Avenue was a project that I asked Brian Torgerson, he was the engineer that oversaw this project. I asked him to take the costs out for all the underground pipe work. Everything, anything that's buried, I don't want included in the cost. Surface improvements only, subgrade material up, road base, asphalt, sidewalk, walls, things like that, everything that was done. That project cost us $1.6 million for surface improvements only. The general fund, the BNC, and the traditional, what I'll call traditional funding sources for streets, paid for less than half of those surface improvements. Our utility funds, our water, stormwater, sewer, and some combination with BYU because they put a secondary water line in, they paid for more than half of the surface improvements on this road. That wall was allowed because we use utility funds to pay for it. If this project had moved forward under the policy as it's written today, this policy or this street would have moved forward in 2011. It was identified as a problem in 2011. We delayed the project intentionally in Public Works to try to coordinate utilities. We knew that eventually we're going to need a storm drain line. We couldn't afford it in 2011. We were going to need a water line. We couldn't afford it when it was originally proposed. And we delayed this project intentionally, allowing the utilities to gather enough money to pay for the utilities that were needed. Those utilities, again, paid for much of the surface improvements on this road. In the current policy, the way it is written, and I know I'm going after the words here in the policy, but there is a section that says that the city will prioritize CIP projects that have missing sidewalk and bike facilities that need to be constructed. In 2011, if this policy would have been in place, the city would have been forced by this policy, we would have been forced to move forward without the coordination with the utilities. The point that I'm trying to make here is it is irresponsible to look at a street and only look at bike and sidewalk needs and say that's the one that's going to be moving forward. I can give you more examples. 820 East, 820 North, east of 9th East. It's a road that is in terrible condition and Public Works knows it. We've known it for 4 or 5 years now, but we've also known that we're going to need a solution for storm drain problems in the Joaquin neighborhood. We intentionally delayed that project knowing that that was going to happen. In the meantime, Westar Gas or Dominion Energy, whatever the latest name is for that company, they have come in and said, we need to tear that road up too. And so Dominion Energy is going in and making significant improvements on that road. The city cannot afford to do the surface improvements on that road. And it's only the people in engineering, again, the ones that are being blindsided a lot by some of these groups. They're the ones that are going in and lobbying and negotiating with Questar Gas to make it so that we can combine our funds with Questar Gas and complete that project. So again, the policy as it's written would force the city. We would be mandated to, at least in my reading, the way it says, we would prioritize CIP projects. There's 3 or 4 other factors that move decisions in public works about moving CIP projects forward, and sometimes we delay them intentionally. I understand
Prioritization, I'd say, Dave. I mean,
and I understand. I'm critiquing a little bit here the intent of the policy, and I agree with the intent of the policy. I don't think the policy, though, is written to follow the intent. And I think that's our biggest concern in public works is the policy written really to follow the intent? And this one is particularly not. This is a great illustration. So one other thing that I would point out before I'll show you a few slides from 820. So Salt Lake City, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they do have a complete streets policy in Salt Lake City. And they have focused, unfortunately, at least in my opinion, they have focused in completing a lot of those projects, doing CIP work that would probably fall into the complete streets category. Problem is they've ignored the street maintenance. This is a news article, linked to a news article that recently was in the Deseret News talking about Salt Lake City needing to bond. They're talking about $20 million per year for the next 10 years in order to catch up with their street maintenance. So this is the same conversation that I've had multiple times with the council about realizing, do we have the financial means to keep up with whether it's the infrastructure on a street or whether it's infrastructure in the ground. The city needs to keep up with the infrastructure before we start talking about building new things. It's easy to build new things, but it's a lot harder to maintain those new things. It's never more evident than in a park, where parks don't, we don't have enough staff, and the lawn starts to burn out. Scott Henderson would tell you that particular issue. Are we really keeping up with the maintenance, with what we're building? And it's one of my responsibilities. Again, why is this so important? Because it falls right in my lap. This is public works. This is not talking about building anything new. If we can figure out how to build it in the first place, it'll be my responsibility to figure out how to maintain it. And I've got to make sure that the policy, and particularly the financial policy of the city, can support the complete streets policy. And right now, I'm pretty nervous about it. So just a couple of pictures, and this is just the end of the presentation. This is 820 North, again, in just terrible condition. And again, we've known it. We know it clearly. But the policy, the point that I think is really important, the policy, the way it's written right now, if the city is not able to negotiate with Questar Gas to complete the street rebuild the way it really should be done, the policy would actually force us, because the upper section of 820 North, it would force us to move to the upper half of it because it's missing sidewalk, and say, go and do this part because we're missing sidewalk. Look at the road condition where we're missing sidewalk, and then look at the road condition where we have sidewalk. And again, the point that I'm making is there's other factors that need to be considered here. And I think, again, I think Public Works, I know it's biased because I'm the director, but I think if you look at what we've been trying to do in Public Works, given our limited budgets, it's a fairly reasonable balance that we've tried to accomplish. Is 24% going to non-motorized modes of transportation, is that reasonable? I understand, and I'll be respectful. I understand some people will say that's not enough, and I understand that. But again, I hope you look at it from my perspective and say, given the cards that we have to play with in Public Works, are we doing a pretty reasonable job in other modes of transportation, in all modes of transportation. And I would have to argue that it's been okay. It's been pretty decent. And if the objective is to go beyond that, I have no problem. But eventually the conversation needs to focus on how do we pay for it? What's the financial obligations to the city? Because at the end of the day, that's my responsibility. So that's all I had.
And I appreciate that. And that is a great perspective to have as we move into these discussions. Any question, any other comments that we want to talk about? We're going to take a few more minutes here, just to wrap things up. George, and then.
Well, you sort of started to touch on it earlier, but I'm curious, Dave, if it can be written in a way that provides that kind of flexibility. I mean, I just, what I heard you describing was precisely the kind of discussion that I would imagine this kind of policy enables us to have, right? I mean, it just means that we're now thinking about, okay, can we put the sidewalk on 820 North right now, or do we have to wait? Well, we have to wait. And here are the reasons why we have to wait. But at least we're sort of asking that question. So it doesn't seem to me that it couldn't be written in a way that provides for the kind of flexibility that you're talking about.
The way I would respond to that question, when I don't attend every TMAC meeting, but I try to get probably 50%. But particularly when the Complete Street policy was first introduced to TMAC, the very short version that it was described to TMAC was that we would take all CIP projects that were proposed in a budget, we would take them to TMAC, they would review them, make comments, maybe even score them and say 1 to 10, this is a 6 or a 7, we're not really completing, we're not doing everything that's in the policy. But those comments would then go back to the city council when those projects were forwarded in budget for approval. And the council at that point could have a conversation about, oh, here's a comment from TMAC that says we need to add sidewalk or we need to add a bike facility on a particular project. And the council could then decide, do we want to add funding for that particular recommendation that came from TMAC? And that would be the end, basically. That's the implementation part of the policy. And that's not how the policy is written right now. It actually requires Public Works to go to the Planning Commission, get exceptions for regular maintenance. All CIP projects have to go to the Planning Commission. And we potentially, again, have this back and forth between City Council and Planning Commission. If there's a determination at the Planning Commission that says, hey, we really don't think this is an excessive cost to add such and such a facility on a CIP project, it puts us in a position where we have to go back to City Council at that point and say, they want, Planning Commission's making a recommendation for, or a mandate, however you want to look at it, for such and such a facility. We don't have the funding for it. You want to take it out of general fund, you want to allocate some additional money for it. The concern that I have with that back and forth, if you understand how CIP projects are bid, if we do this in the bidding atmosphere for a CIP, so let's say we go to Planning Commission in January, our project's ready to go, and that determination is made in January, and it delays it by a month or two. Do you think the CIP cost is going to go up by the time we bid it in March? You bet it will. If you bid a project in January, you're almost guaranteed the lowest cost of the construction season. But if we have a policy that delays bidding and pushes us into the March, April, June, or May, June timeframe, you can guarantee that project will cost another 10, 20, maybe even 25% over and above what you would pay in January. And again, that's one of the points that I tried to help people understand. It does. These are indirect costs coming to the city, but they are eventually realized in one form or another. And I think it's important for this group to know, I would be willing even today, if that was the decision of this group, the city council said, go to TMAC, let's talk about what projects are proposed in the upcoming budget. Let's get comments from TMAC today so that we can have that conversation in the upcoming budget approval. I'd do it today. I have no problem doing that.
The 820 North, I mean, I've actually, that's my neighborhood, that street. People have been complaining to me that it's dangerous for children to walk to Kiwanis.
It's terrible.
Right? So we've got a street that was, I just want to know
what's the solution to get a street like that in working order for the safety of the neighborhood, rather than to just simply, I mean, if it's just simply a matter of not having enough funds, or then maybe that's the conversation we need to have. But if it's also a matter of adopting a more back and forth, flexible kind of conversation that allows a little more push and pull for people to say, this is a priority for the neighborhood. They want it. The city decides that they want it. I see that as a plus. I mean, I definitely see what you're saying. I mean, I don't see that a policy that binds you in the way that you're describing is a positive, but I don't think I'm just trying to figure out a way to provide that kind of flexibility.
So we've actually been in touch with the neighborhood on 820 North, very similar to what we did in Stadium Avenue. We went to the chair, the neighborhood chair. We had a number of meetings with them, and we've said, hey, we know Stadium Avenue needs to be redone. There's safety issues, there's some concerns, but here's where the city is financially, not just from a streets, but utility standpoint. We don't want to repair a road and then have it dug up 2 or 3 years later. There's not a worse picture we can paint for the public's perception. And so we intentionally go to neighborhoods. We try to communicate with those neighborhoods. Now, I think we've struggled a little bit on 820 North in getting, as much word out, even with Kiwanis, the park improvements that we did there. We got some feedback from neighbors that they weren't really sure what was going on. But once the word generally gets out, they understand, okay, yeah, I can see why we don't want to, rebuild a road and then have Questar Gas dig it up the next year. That makes sense. And it's sometimes just a matter of being patient. It's a matter of getting all the funds, all the pieces of the puzzle to fall together. And again, that's what most of the work in engineering, it generally takes, just getting everybody on the same page so that we can get all that work done, repair the road, and then be done with it.
Real quick. Go ahead, Morgan. So I appreciate seeing the pictures of 820. I drive a lot of places every day doing things for the church, and that is a war zone.
I told engineering, this has got to be our worst street in the city. If we had a list of the top 10 worst ones, this has got to be darn close to the top.
I do get complaints about Nevada Avenue in front of the Spring Creek Elementary School. The best part of that is someone had to dig it up to put in a new home. And it just makes the contrast all the worse. It's alligatored, it's horrible. I have people stopping me every week, either in church or they'll roll down their window and say, when are they going to fix this road? And I said, when it falls to pieces, because it's beyond maintenance. It's going to have to be completely rebuilt. And we don't have the money to rebuild it now. And it is a matter of funding. I mean, 820 North would not be in the shape that it's in now if we had enough funding to really be keeping our streets up.
Absolutely. And I think it becomes an even bigger issue when we talk about pedestrians. Again, Public Works would be one of the first departments that say, we know we're behind in pedestrian. Just picture, 5 years ago when we didn't have the $500,000, our funding source, we were 50,000 or less. How much money is 50,000? How much sidewalks going to be replaced or repaired with $50,000? It's not very much in a city this size. And if there's a mechanism of trying to figure out how to get more funding for pedestrians, I am all for it. But I don't want to lose the sight of where we're at in other modes of transportation. And I need to be really careful here. One of the intents in writing this memo, it's not to advocate for more funding. I have burned so many bridges in Public Works about increases in funding and had similar conversations about water, wastewater, stormwater, where we're at. My torch on funding increases is about out. It's just extinguished. So, I don't want the memo misinterpreted for that. But I think there is a reality, a financial reality that needs to be considered in implementation for this policy.
And I agree with that. And that's a key factor in work recognizing policy is the financial factor. And so I think if we can make things flexible enough that that becomes a very key point in that policy, I think we can come up with something. And I hope that's the plan anyway. I spent an hour and a half with Gary yesterday, and he said, let's talk about tools. And that's all we want to talk about is tools where we can actually, what can we do? Gives us an opportunity to see something. I have an office building and everybody wants me to put an elevator in my office building and make it 8. And they say, okay, I'm going to raise your rents $300 a month. So to get this elevator, well, I guess I can take the stairs. And I think those are the things that we get to look at in the future. And so we'll deal with that as we go forward. Hey, one last comment, then we're going to.
I started earlier to talk about policies and decisions have consequences and balancing things and what the public wants and what the public's willing to pay for. I think we absolutely, that needs to be part of that discussion. If the community says, we want these policies, we want to raise the level of service for our road treatments, they need to understand that there's a cost consequence to that. And I think that helps temper our wants if we understand that we have to pay for them. And I think that's absolutely part of the conversation.
All right, Gary, what do you see us doing from now going forward with this?
Well, I'm really glad we had this meeting. I think this was the exact goal that Planning Commission wanted out of this, to have these conversations. And actually, Stadium Avenue was one of the things that kind of prompted this meeting. I kept hearing in meetings, Stadium Avenue under a complete street policy wouldn't have been done. And if that's what a complete street policy does, well, it's stupid. We shouldn't have it, because I think everybody's pretty glad about Stadium Avenue. And so if the language in there doesn't equal that, or the intent of a street policy is to not do a Stadium Avenue, well, then that's a silly policy. And I don't think any of us would support it. And so I went back and asked TMAC, help me understand. I see the ambiguity in the language. Is this what you're intending? And they're saying, no. Planning Commission, would you intend something like that? No. Okay. Well, if people are reading this differently, we need to have a conversation about what the intent of this is. And then once Planning Commission can take this meeting and digest it, and then go back and meet with TMAC and digest that, and continue to meet with Public Works, the fire department, and other interested groups, then I think the intent Planning Commission is to take where TMAC began, and with all this feedback, come up with a draft policy that ultimately would come to the council for consideration.
Wayne, can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
I've never had, other than the Planning Commission, we've never had a city board where a department like Power Department, we've had a power board for years, would actually rule on whether individual projects in CIP should be done or not. That would be a huge step different than we've ever done in the past.
Be a substantial departure from the role of an advisory board to make it a regulatory board. That's a very different animal. That's one we've resisted over the years.
I think you guys need to understand that. Because this policy changed that dramatically, in my mind.
Well, and again, I don't think that was TMAC's intent. Now, if people are reading the language and taking that meaning from it, clearly we've got a problem. The language needs to be changed, because I don't think Planning Commission wants that to happen. In my conversations with members of TMAC, they don't want that to happen. And so that's why part of this meeting is hopefully everyone take a deep breath, step back, talk about what the intent really is, and let's not get too bogged down in specific language yet. And then Planning Commission will come back with another draft.
I appreciate what TMAC is doing and the Planning Commission, and Gary, I hope that we can somehow keep the council up to speed, so that if it gets to council and all of a sudden, wait a minute, what are we thinking about this? This may not be exactly what we thought either. So I would like to have the council being up to date, being brought up to date quite regularly. But
I think that's been very helpful to have taken this draft policy and look at specific instances of where there may have been unintended consequences had the policy been in place. And I think one of the questions that the council and the planning commission ought to consider is, where is the proper location for this? Is it a guidance and therefore belongs, say, in the general plan? Or does it rise to the level of needing to be an ordinance, in which becomes very prescriptive about what you actually do with it?
Yeah, I agree with that. So, thank you so much for all the time, Dave.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. I know I stirred the pot pretty hard with the memo, and I wanted to get a little bit more explanation, so I appreciate the patience and the
I
opportunity.
appreciate all of you, the time you put in, the effort that you put into coming here. This is a great conversation. These are what we hope to do, is have these conversations in our community, and look forward to further work on this. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. Need to adjourn.
Oh, yeah.